At Chicago O'Hare International Airport, amidst the familiar chaos of departure gates and rushing passengers, a woman sat alone at gate B7. Her worn navy blazer had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her eyes, those deep brown eyes, held secrets that seemed to weigh more than the small black suitcase at her feet. Dr. Elena Vasquez clutched her boarding pass for Flight 847 to London, her fingers trembling slightly as she watched other passengers board ahead of her. Nobody noticed her. Nobody asked why she looked so exhausted, why her usually pristine appearance seemed disheveled, or why she kept checking her phone with the urgency of someone expecting terrible news. To everyone around her, she was just another face in the crowd, another anonymous traveler with somewhere to be. But before we begin this story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us which country you're listening from. But Elena knew that in the next 8 hours, everything would change. The contents of her suitcase would either save thousands of lives or cost her everything she'd worked for. As she stood to board the plane, her heart hammered against her ribs. She had no idea that her presence on Flight 847 would trigger a chain of events that would have federal agents scrambling, air traffic controllers panicking, and a veteran pilot making the most dangerous decision of his career. What she carried wasn't just luggage, it was hope. And sometimes, hope requires breaking every rule in the book. The fluorescent lights of Chicago O'Hare cast harsh shadows across Elena's face as she settled into seat 14C. A middle seat she'd specifically requested despite having enough airline miles for first class. She needed to be invisible, unremarkable, just another passenger on just another transatlantic flight. The businessman in 14A barely glanced at her as he continued his phone conversation about quarterly projections, while the elderly woman in 14B offered a polite smile before returning to her crossword puzzle. Elena carefully placed her black suitcase in the overhead compartment, her hands steady despite the storm raging in her chest. Inside that suitcase were 12 vials of what looked like ordinary saline solution, but Elena knew better. Those vials contained the culmination of 8 years of research, a potential cure for a rare blood disorder that had claimed her younger sister's life and was now threatening hundreds of children across Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard United Flight 847 with nonstop service to London Heathrow, announced the chief flight attendant, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver hair. We'll be cruising at an altitude of 37,000 feet with an expected flight time of 7 hours and 45 minutes. Elena closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. 3 days ago, her research lab at Northwestern Memorial Hospital had been shut down by the pharmaceutical company that funded her work. They'd called her research unmarketable and financially unviable, despite the promising results she'd achieved. The company wanted to focus on more profitable treatments for common ailments rather than rare diseases that affected only a few thousand people worldwide. But Elena had contacts in London. Dr. James Morrison at Great Ormond Street Hospital had been following her work and believed in its potential. He'd arranged for her to bring her samples to London for independent testing, away from corporate interference. The only problem was getting there without her former employers discovering what she was carrying. Captain Michael Torres, a 23-year veteran of commercial aviation, was conducting his final pre-flight checks in the cockpit. At 52, he'd flown over 2 million miles and prided himself on his perfect safety record. His co-pilot, First Officer Sarah Chun, was reviewing the weather patterns over the Atlantic when their screens displayed an encrypted message from air traffic control. "That's odd," Sarah murmured, adjusting her headset. "I'm getting a priority message, but it's coded for medical emergency protocols." Captain Torres frowned and leaned over to read the message. His expression grew serious as he absorbed the information. The message was brief but alarming. Flight 847. Passenger Elena Vasquez, seat 14C. Medical researcher carrying critical biological samples. Potential threat assessment required. Maintain normal flight path pending further instructions. "Medical threat?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with concern. "Should we delay takeoff?" Torres had seen these types of alerts before. Usually they involve passengers with infectious diseases or dangerous medical conditions. But something about this particular message felt different. The wording was unusual, and the fact that it mentioned biological samples suggested something more complex than a typical health concern. No, he decided after a moment. We proceed as scheduled, but I want you to monitor all communications. If this escalates, we may need to make some quick decisions. Meanwhile, Elena was unaware of the attention she'd attracted. She'd been careful to book her ticket under her own name. Using a false identity would have raised more red flags, but she'd hoped her departure would go unnoticed for at least a few hours. She pulled out a worn paperback novel and tried to lose herself in its pages, but her mind kept drifting to the children she was trying to help. There was Marcus, an 8-year-old from Manchester whose parents had written to her after seeing a news article about her research. His condition was progressing rapidly, and traditional treatments weren't working. There was Isabella, a 12-year-old from Rome whose grandmother had started an online petition to get Elena's treatment approved. And there were dozens of others, children whose faces Elena had memorized from the letters and emails that arrived daily at her lab. The pharmaceutical company executives couldn't understand why she'd risk her career for such a small patient population. They'd offered her a generous severance package and a recommendation letter for other positions. But Elena couldn't accept money while children continued to suffer from a condition she believed she could treat. "Excuse me," the businessman in 14A said, finally ending his phone call. "You look familiar. Aren't you Dr. Vasquez from Northwestern Memorial?" Elena's blood ran cold. She'd been recognized. "I'm sorry. You must have me confused with someone else," she replied, keeping her voice steady. The man studied her face more carefully. "No, I'm sure it's you. I'm Brad Hoffman from Meridian Pharmaceuticals. We met at the medical conference in Boston last year. I heard about what happened with your research program. Real shame. You were doing interesting work." Elena forced a polite smile while her mind raced. Meridian Pharmaceuticals was one of Northwestern's biggest competitors, and if Brad recognized her, it wouldn't be long before word got back to her former employers about her travel plans. "I think you're mistaken," she repeated, returning to her book with an air of finality that discouraged further conversation. Brad shrugged and went back to his laptop, but Elena noticed him typing something on his phone. Her heart sank as she realized her carefully planned escape might already be compromised. As Flight 847 taxied toward the runway, Elena pressed her face against the small window and watched Chicago's skyline fade into the distance. She thought about her sister Carmen, who had died at age 16 after battling the same rare blood disorder for 3 years. Elena had been in medical school then, helpless to do anything but watch as Carmen grew weaker despite the best efforts of her medical team. "I won't let them stop me, Carmen," she whispered to her reflection in the window. "Not when we're this close." The plane accelerated down the runway, and Elena felt the familiar sensation of takeoff. That moment when solid ground disappears and you're suspended between where you've been and where you're going. As Chicago fell away below them, she had no idea that federal agents were already mobilizing, that her former employers had triggered a chain of alerts that would soon reach the highest levels of aviation security. In the cockpit, Captain Torres received another encrypted message, this one marked with the highest priority code he'd ever seen. As he read it, his experienced hands tightened on the controls, and he exchanged a meaningful glance with Sarah. "Change of plans," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his career. "We're going to need to deviate from our flight path." Sarah's eyes widened. Without authorization from air traffic control, Torres looked back toward the passenger cabin, where Elena sat unaware of the storm gathering around her. "Sometimes," he said, "doing the right thing means breaking the rules." 2 hours into the flight, Elena had managed to calm her nerves enough to doze fitfully when the plane's intercom crackled to life. Captain Torres's voice filled the cabin, but there was something different about his usual professional tone, an undercurrent of tension that made several passengers look up from their meals and entertainment screens. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to unexpected weather conditions over the Atlantic, we're going to be making a slight course correction. This may add approximately 30 minutes to our flight time. but it will ensure a smoother journey for everyone aboard. Thank you for your patience. Elena's eyes snapped open. She'd flown this route dozens of times for medical conferences, and she knew the weather patterns. The announcement felt wrong somehow, too vague and carefully worded. She glanced at the flight information screen on the seat back in front of her, which still showed their original flight path with no indication of weather delays. In the cockpit, the tension was palpable. Captain Torres had just made an announcement that was technically true, but deliberately misleading. He was indeed changing course, but not because of weather conditions. The encrypted messages from air traffic control had become increasingly urgent, with federal agencies demanding that Flight 847 be diverted to the nearest airport for an immediate security inspection. Chicago Tower to Flight 847, came the voice through their headsets. You are ordered to return to O'Hare immediately. This is not a request. Torres exchanged a look with First Officer Chun, who was monitoring multiple communication channels simultaneously. Captain, she said quietly, I'm getting reports that FBI and CDC officials are standing by at O'Hare. They're treating this as a potential bioterrorism threat. Bioterrorism? Torres felt his jaw clench. He'd been flying for over 2 decades, had served in the Air Force before joining commercial aviation, and his instincts had never steered him wrong. Something about this situation didn't add up. What exactly do we know about Dr. Vasquez? Sarah had been researching Elena during the flight, pulling up public records and news articles on her secure tablet. She's a hematologist and researcher, specializes in rare blood disorders. Won 8 awards for her work, published in the New England Journal of Medicine multiple times. No criminal record, no known connections to terrorist organizations. Her research was shut down 3 days ago by Northwestern Memorial due to funding issues. Torres processed this information while monitoring their position over the Atlantic. They were approaching the point of no return, the moment when it would be more fuel efficient to continue to London than to turn back to Chicago. In a few minutes, that decision would be made for them by physics and aviation regulations. Captain, Sarah continued, I'm also seeing news reports about a group of children in London who are critically ill. There's some kind of rare blood condition spreading through several hospitals. The British Health Service has been asking for international assistance. Torres felt something click into place. Pull up everything you can find about Dr. Vasquez's research. What specifically was she working on? Meanwhile, Elena had noticed that several passengers were becoming restless. The businessman next to her was making hushed phone calls, and she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach drop. Yes, she's definitely on this flight. And should we be concerned about contamination? The elderly woman in 14B, whose name Elena had learned was Margaret, leaned over with a concerned expression. Dear, that young man seems to be talking about you. Are you feeling all right? You look quite pale. Elena managed a weak smile. I'm fine, thank you. Just not a very good flyer. But Margaret's sharp eyes had noticed more than Elena realized. You're a doctor, aren't you? I can always tell. My late husband was a physician. You have that look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Elena was about to deny it when Brad Hoffman suddenly stood up and approached their row. His expression was serious, and he was followed by another passenger, a woman Elena didn't recognize, but who had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. Dr. Vasquez, Brad said loudly enough that nearby passengers turned to look. I think we need to talk. The woman with him flashed a badge discreetly. I'm Agent Patricia Walsh, FBI. I'm going to need you to come with me to the front of the plane. Please bring your carry-on luggage. Elena's world tilted. They'd found her. Somehow, despite her precautions, federal agents were already on the flight. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had they been tracking her research materials? Did they know about her contact in London? I'm sorry, Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady, but I haven't done anything wrong. I'm simply traveling to London for a medical consultation. Agent Walsh's expression softened slightly. Dr. Vasquez, I understand this is confusing, but we have reports that you may be carrying biological materials that pose a potential threat to public safety. We need to verify the contents of your luggage. Biological materials? Margaret interjected, her voice rising. What kind of biological materials? Other passengers were beginning to take notice, and Elena could feel the atmosphere in the cabin shifting from casual travel fatigue to genuine concern. Parents were pulling their children closer, and several people had their phones out, probably trying to call relatives on the ground. Elena knew she had two choices: cooperate and hope she could explain her situation, or refuse and create an even bigger scene that would definitely result in the plane being diverted. Either way, the children waiting for her treatment in London would suffer. "The materials I'm carrying are completely safe," she said, standing slowly. "They're medical samples for legitimate research purposes." "Then you won't mind if we verify that?" Agent Walsh replied, gesturing toward the front of the plane. As Elena reached for her suitcase in the overhead compartment, her hands were trembling. She knew that once federal agents examined her vials, they would want to confiscate them for testing. By the time the bureaucratic process was complete, the samples would be degraded and useless, and her opportunity to help the sick children would be lost. In the cockpit, Captain Torres was monitoring the increasingly frantic communications from air traffic control while watching the drama unfold in his passenger cabin through the security monitors. "Flight 847, this is Chicago Tower," the voice crackled through his headset. "You are ordered to return immediately. Federal agencies are treating this as a code red biological threat." Torres made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career, or make him a hero. He reached over and switched off his transponder, the device that allowed air traffic control to track his exact position. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to trust me on this. We're not turning around." First Officer Chen stared at him in disbelief. "Captain, you can't be serious. Disobeying federal orders, flying without a transponder. They'll throw us in prison and revoke our licenses permanently." Torres was already adjusting their course, steering further north over the Atlantic toward a flight path that would take them directly to London. "Sometimes," he said, "the right thing isn't the legal thing. That woman back there isn't a terrorist. She's a doctor trying to save children's lives." "How can you possibly know that?" Torres glanced at the research Sarah had compiled about Elena's work. "Because 23 years ago, I flew a medical evacuation mission in the Air Force. We had to break about 6 different regulations to get a critically injured child to a hospital in Germany. I was court-martialed for it, nearly lost my commission. But that child lived, and she's a doctor herself now." As he spoke, Torres was calculating fuel consumption, weather patterns, and the political implications of what he was about to do. "Sarah, I need you to send a message to London Air Traffic Control. Tell them we have a medical emergency on board and are requesting priority landing clearance." "What kind of medical emergency?" Torres looked back toward the passenger cabin, where Elena was being escorted to the front of the plane by Agent Walsh. "Tell them," he said, "that we have a doctor on board who may be carrying the cure for a disease that's killing children." In the passenger cabin, Elena found herself seated in first class under the watchful eye of Agent Walsh, with her precious suitcase on the seat between them. The FBI agent was examining Elena's identification and travel documents, while other passengers craned their necks to see what was happening. "Dr. Vasquez," Agent Walsh said, "I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation. We've received reports that you may be carrying dangerous biological agents. The CDC has flagged your research materials as potentially hazardous." Elena felt a surge of anger. "Hazardous?" "Agent Walsh, the only thing hazardous about my research is that children are dying while bureaucrats and pharmaceutical executives debate profit margins. I understand your frustration, but protocol exists for a reason. Biological materials need to be properly tested and approved before they can cross international borders." "Protocol?" Elena's voice rose, and several passengers turned to stare. "Let me tell you about protocol, Agent Walsh. Protocol says that pharmaceutical companies can shut down research that might help rare disease patients because there's not enough money in it. Protocol says that while I'm sitting here being interrogated, children in London hospitals are getting sicker every day because they can't access experimental treatments." Margaret, who had been listening from her seat, suddenly stood up and walked over to them. "Excuse me," she said in the firm voice of someone accustomed to being heard, "but I couldn't help overhearing. Did you say there are children dying?" Agent Walsh looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, this is a federal investigation. I need you to return to your seat. But Margaret was already examining Elena with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent decades evaluating people's character. You're Dr. Elena Vasquez, aren't you? The hematologist who's been working on treatments for Kepler-Morrison syndrome. Elena's eyes widened in surprise. How do you know about my research? Margaret smiled sadly. Because my granddaughter Emma has Kepler-Morrison syndrome. She's 8 years old, and she's dying in a hospital in Manchester because the current treatments aren't working. I've been following your research for 2 years, hoping and praying that someone like you would find a way to help her. The first-class cabin fell silent. Agent Walsh looked from Margaret to Elena, her expression shifting as she began to understand the broader implications of the situation. Mrs. Agent Walsh began. Whitmore. Margaret Whitmore. And Agent Walsh. If this woman really has something that could help my granddaughter and other children like her, then maybe we should be helping her instead of treating her like a criminal. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know if my treatment will work, but I have data suggesting it might help children with your granddaughter's condition. That's why I'm trying to get to London, to work with doctors there who can give it a proper trial. Agent Walsh was clearly out of her depth. Her training had prepared her for terrorists and smugglers, not desperate doctors trying to save children's lives. She was about to respond when the plane's intercom crackled to life again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. I need everyone to remain seated and stay calm. We're experiencing some technical difficulties with our communications equipment, but everything is under control. Flight attendants, please prepare for some potential turbulence. Elena caught Agent Walsh's eye. Agent Walsh, that's not about technical difficulties, is it? Agent Walsh was listening to something in her earpiece, her expression growing more serious by the second. No, she said quietly, it's not. Dr. Vasquez, I think we're about to find out just how far your captain is willing to go to get you to London. Captain Torres knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The radio chatter in his headset had become increasingly frantic as air traffic controllers on both sides of the Atlantic tried to locate Flight 847, which had seemingly vanished from their screens when he disabled the transponder. He was now flying what amounted to a ghost plane over the North Atlantic, carrying 237 passengers who had no idea their captain had just committed what could be classified as hijacking his own aircraft. Chicago Tower to any aircraft in the vicinity of Flight 847's last known position, came the increasingly desperate voice through the radio. United 847 has gone dark. Repeat, we have lost contact with United 847 approximately 800 miles northeast of Newfoundland. First Officer Sarah Chun was monitoring multiple emergency frequencies while trying to maintain her composure. Captain, they're scrambling fighter jets from the Canadian Air Force. They're treating this as a potential hijacking situation. Torres adjusted their heading slightly, taking them further north to avoid the most heavily monitored flight corridors. How long before they find us? Maybe an hour, maybe less if they get lucky with satellite tracking. Sarah's voice was tight with stress. Michael, what we're doing, this could be considered an act of terrorism. They'll prosecute us to the full extent of the law. Torres was quiet for a moment, his experienced hands steady on the controls despite the magnitude of what he'd done. Sarah, in my 23 years of flying, I've transported millions of passengers safely to their destinations. Businessmen going to meetings, families going on vacation, students studying abroad. Routine flights with routine purposes. He paused, checking their fuel consumption and position. But today we have a passenger who might be carrying something that could save children's lives. When I look at it that way, the choice seems pretty clear, even if it costs us everything. Torres glanced at the photo of his own daughter that he kept clipped to his instrument panel, a picture of Sarah Torres, whom he'd named his co-pilot after, on her graduation day from medical school. Especially then. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, the tension between Elena, Agent Walsh, and Margaret had created an unlikely alliance. Margaret had spent the last 30 minutes describing her granddaughter's condition in detail, the progressive weakness, the inability of her blood to carry oxygen effectively, the way Emma had gone from a vibrant, active child to someone who could barely walk up a flight of stairs. The doctors in Manchester have tried everything, Margaret explained, her voice breaking slightly. Transfusions, experimental drugs, even a bone marrow transplant that didn't take. They told us last week that Emma has maybe 3 months left. Elena listened with the focused attention of a physician, asking technical questions about Emma's treatment history and symptoms. Mrs. Whitmore, based on what you're describing, I believe Emma would be an ideal candidate for my treatment protocol. The mechanism of action is designed specifically for patients who haven't responded to traditional therapies. Agent Walsh had been listening to their conversation while simultaneously receiving updates through her earpiece. Dr. Vasquez, she said, I need you to understand something. The reports we received suggested that you were carrying biological weapons. The language used was potential bioterrorism threat and unauthorized biological agents. Elena felt a chill of understanding. Someone wanted you to think I was a terrorist. Who would do that? Margaret asked. Elena's mind raced through the possibilities. My former employer, Meridian Pharmaceuticals. They'd have the most to lose if my treatment proved successful. If they can get me arrested for bioterrorism, they can seize my research and either bury it or develop it themselves under their own patents. Agent Walsh was beginning to look uncomfortable with her role in the situation. Dr. Vasquez, assuming that's true, my orders were still to detain you and secure your materials. I can't just ignore federal directives because of a compelling story. But you can investigate whether those directives were based on false information, Margaret said firmly. Agent Walsh, you have the authority to verify the claims against Dr. Vasquez, don't you? Before Agent Walsh could respond, the plane's intercom crackled to life again. Captain Torres's voice filled the cabin, but this time there was no pretense about technical difficulties. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I need to be completely honest with you about our situation. We are currently flying without communication with air traffic control due to circumstances involving one of our passengers. I want to assure you that there is no immediate danger to the aircraft or to any of you, but I felt you deserved to know the truth about what's happening. The cabin erupted in worried murmurs and confused questions. Elena could see passengers reaching for their phones, trying to call relatives or access internet connections that would work at 37,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. Torres continued, We have a passenger on board who is carrying medical supplies that may be critical for treating sick children. Due to political and legal complications, there have been attempts to prevent these supplies from reaching their destination. I have made the decision to continue our flight to London, where these medical supplies can be properly evaluated by qualified physicians. Is he insane? Brad Hoffman called out from his seat. He's basically confessing to hijacking the plane. Agent Walsh stood up, her training taking over. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Federal Agent Patricia Walsh. I need everyone to remain calm. The situation is under control. But Elena could see that the situation was far from under control. Passengers were scared, confused, and beginning to panic. Some were demanding to know if there were dangerous materials on board, while others were insisting that the plane return to Chicago immediately. Margaret stood up with the authority of someone who had spent decades managing crisis situations. Everyone, please listen to me, she said in a voice that carried throughout the first-class cabin. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I'm a retired hospital administrator. I've spent 40 years in healthcare, and I want you to understand what's really happening here. The cabin quieted as passengers turned to listen to the elderly woman who spoke with such calm confidence. Dr. Vasquez is carrying medical supplies that could potentially save the lives of children who are dying from a rare blood disorder. There are no dangerous materials on this plane. There are medical supplies that pharmaceutical companies want to prevent from reaching sick children because there's no profit in treating rare diseases. Elena watched in amazement as Margaret continued her impromptu speech. Our captain has made a difficult decision to help ensure that these supplies reach doctors in London who can evaluate them properly. Now, we can either panic and make this situation worse, or we can support what may be the only chance these children have. A woman in her 30s with 2 young children raised her hand tentatively. But what about us? What happens when we land in London? Will we be arrested? Agent Walsh found herself in the unprecedented position of having to provide reassurance about a situation she wasn't sure she could control. The passengers on this flight are not responsible for the captain's decisions. When we land, there will be questions and paperwork, but no passengers will be charged with any crimes. What about the captain? Someone called out. Agent Walsh hesitated. The truth was that Captain Torres would likely face serious federal charges, including hijacking, reckless endangerment, and violation of international aviation treaties. His career was over, and he would probably spend years in prison. Elena had been listening to the conversation while grappling with her own guilt. Agent Walsh, she said quietly, Captain Torres is risking everything because of me. I can't let him sacrifice his life for my research. What are you suggesting? Elena looked at her suitcase, then at Margaret, who was watching her with hopeful eyes. Maybe there's another way. Agent Walsh, would you be willing to examine my research materials right here, in front of witnesses? If you can verify that they're legitimate medical supplies and not biological weapons, maybe we can resolve this situation before we land. Agent Walsh considered this proposal. She had basic training in biological hazard identification, and she could contact CDC specialists via secure communication to get expert analysis of whatever Elena was carrying. Dr. Vasquez, she said, if I examine your materials and confirm they're legitimate medical supplies, I'll recommend that the charges against Captain Torres be reduced to regulatory violations rather than terrorism-related offenses. But if I find anything suspicious, you won't, Elena said firmly. Agent Walsh, I've dedicated my entire career to saving lives. I would never carry anything that could harm people. Margaret reached over and squeezed Elena's hand. Dr. Vasquez, whatever you're carrying, I trust you. And I think everyone else on this plane should too. Elena looked around the first-class cabin, seeing the faces of ordinary people who had been caught up in extraordinary circumstances. Agent Walsh, she said, let's open my suitcase. As Elena reached for her luggage, the plane suddenly shuddered with turbulence. Real turbulence this time. Captain Torres's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching some rough weather over the North Atlantic. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, please prepare for moderate to severe turbulence. Elena gripped her suitcase tighter as the plane bucked and rolled through the storm clouds. Through the small windows, she could see lightning flashing in the darkness outside. But the real storm, she knew, was just beginning. Agent Walsh steadied herself against the turbulence and looked Elena directly in the eyes. Dr. Vasquez, she said, I hope you're right about what you're carrying. Because in about 4 hours, we're going to land in London, and a lot of people are going to want answers. Elena nodded, her jaw set with determination. Agent Walsh, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. What I'm carrying could change everything for children like Emma. And I won't let politics or fear stop that from happening. As Flight 847 continued its unauthorized journey across the Atlantic, Elena prepared to reveal the contents of her suitcase to a federal agent, a dozen passengers, and ultimately, the world. She had no idea that her courage in this moment would spark a global conversation about medical ethics, corporate responsibility, and the lengths people will go to save lives. The turbulence outside was nothing compared to the storm waiting for them in London. At 35,000 feet over the North Atlantic, Elena Vasquez carefully opened her black suitcase under the watchful eyes of FBI agent Patricia Walsh and a small crowd of passengers who had gathered in the first-class cabin. The turbulence had subsided, but the tension in the air was palpable as Elena revealed the contents that had triggered an international incident. Inside the suitcase, nestled in protective foam, were 12 sealed vials containing what appeared to be clear liquid. Each vial was meticulously labeled with technical information, dates, and batch numbers. Alongside the vials were folders containing research data, patient files with identifying information redacted, and official documentation from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Agent Walsh put on protective gloves and carefully examined one of the vials. Dr. Vasquez, explain to me exactly what this is. Elena's voice was steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Those vials contain a modified enzyme therapy that I've been developing for 8 years. It's designed to treat Kepler-Morrison syndrome, a rare genetic blood disorder that affects approximately 2,000 children worldwide. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the vials that might hold hope for her granddaughter. How does it work? Elena shifted into her teaching mode, the passion evident in her voice. Kepler-Morrison syndrome is caused by a genetic mutation that prevents the body from producing a specific enzyme needed for oxygen transport in the blood. Traditional treatments try to manage symptoms, but they don't address the underlying enzyme deficiency. My therapy introduces a bioengineered version of the missing enzyme directly into the bloodstream. Agent Walsh was photographing the vials and documentation with her phone while simultaneously relaying information to federal authorities. Dr. Vasquez, if this treatment is so promising, why isn't it being tested through official channels? Because official channels don't care about rare diseases, Elena replied, unable to hide her frustration. Meridian Pharmaceuticals calculated that even if my treatment was 100% effective, the potential market wouldn't justify the cost of clinical trials and FDA approval. They shut down my research 3 days ago and offered me a severance package to walk away quietly. Brad Hoffman, who had been listening from his seat, finally spoke up. Dr. Vasquez, I work for Meridian's competitor, but I have to say what you're describing sounds more like a business decision than conspiracy. Elena turned to face him directly. Mr. Hoffman, how much do you think Meridian spent on developing their latest cholesterol medication? Probably around $800 million over 10 years. And how many people take cholesterol medication? Globally? Maybe 200 million patients. Elena nodded. Now, my treatment for Kepler-Morrison syndrome would cost maybe $50 million to bring to market, but there are only 2,000 potential patients worldwide. The math doesn't work for pharmaceutical companies, so children like Emma die while executives debate profit margins. Agent Walsh finished her examination of the vials and documentation. She had been in contact with CDC specialists via secure communication, and their preliminary assessment was that Elena's materials appeared to be legitimate medical research samples with no apparent biological threat. Dr. Vasquez, Agent Walsh said, assuming these materials are what you claim they are, why didn't you go through proper channels to transport them internationally? Because proper channels would have meant weeks of paperwork, during which time the samples would have degraded. Children with Kepler-Morrison syndrome don't have weeks to spare. Elena pulled out a folder containing patient photographs and medical records. Agent Walsh, I want you to see the faces of the children I'm trying to help. She showed photographs of Emma Whitmore, Marcus from Manchester, Isabella from Rome, and a dozen other children from across Europe. Each photo showed a child with the telltale signs of Kepler-Morrison syndrome: pale complexion, fatigue, and the particular look of someone whose body isn't getting enough oxygen. Margaret was studying the photo of her granddaughter with tears in her eyes. That's Emma last month, she said softly. She used to be so active, so full of life. Now, she can barely walk to the bathroom without getting winded. Agent Walsh felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. She had joined the FBI to protect people, but suddenly she wasn't sure who needed protecting in this situation: the public from a potential biological threat, or sick children from corporate indifference. In the cockpit, Captain Torres was dealing with his own moral calculations. He was monitoring emergency radio frequencies and could hear the growing international response to Flight 847's disappearance. The Canadian Air Force had scrambled fighter jets. NATO was coordinating a search effort, and both American and British authorities were treating the situation as a potential terrorist incident. Sarah, he said to his co-pilot, I need you to send a message to London Air Traffic Control. Tell them we're requesting emergency landing clearance due to a medical emergency involving critical research materials for pediatric patients. Sarah looked at him with a mixture of admiration and terror. Captain, even if we land safely in London, the diplomatic consequences of this are going to be enormous. We violated international aviation treaties, ignored federal orders, and essentially disappeared a commercial aircraft over the Atlantic. Torres was calculating their remaining fuel and estimated time of arrival. Sarah, 30 years from now, when you're old and gray, which do you think you'll regret more? following orders that might have cost children their lives, or breaking rules to give those children chance. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then reached for the radio. London Heathrow. This is United Flight 847 requesting priority landing clearance. We have a medical emergency involving time-sensitive biological materials for pediatric treatment. Back in the first-class cabin, Agent Walsh had finished her preliminary examination of Elena's research materials and was conferring with CDC specialists via secure communication. The verdict was clear. Elena's vials contained legitimate medical research samples with no apparent threat to public safety. Dr. Vasquez, Agent Walsh announced to the gathered passengers, based on my examination and consultation with federal health authorities, your materials appear to be exactly what you claim they are: experimental medical treatments for a rare pediatric blood disorder. A collective sigh of relief went through the cabin, but Elena knew they weren't out of danger yet. Agent Walsh, what happens when we land? Will Captain Torres be arrested? Agent Walsh hesitated. The truth was complicated. Dr. Vasquez, Captain Torres has violated numerous federal regulations and international aviation treaties. There will be consequences regardless of his motivations. Margaret stood up with the determination of someone who had spent decades fighting bureaucracy on behalf of patients. Agent Walsh, surely there must be something we can do. This man is a hero, not a criminal. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand your feelings, but the law doesn't make exceptions for good intentions. Elena felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. Captain Torres was going to lose everything because of her research, and even if her treatment proved successful, he would still face criminal charges. There has to be another way, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. Brad Hoffman, who had been unusually quiet during Elena's presentation, suddenly spoke up. Dr. Vasquez, what if I told you there might be a way to help both Captain Torres and your research? Everyone turned to look at the pharmaceutical executive. What do you mean? Elena asked suspiciously. I've been making some calls while you were dealing with Agent Walsh, Brad said, holding up his phone. My company, Phoenix Biotech, specializes in rare disease treatments. We're smaller than Meridian, but we focus specifically on conditions that larger companies ignore because they're not profitable enough. Elena stared at him. You want to buy my research? I want to fund your research, Brad corrected. Dr. Vasquez, if you're willing to partner with Phoenix Biotech, we can fast-track your treatment through clinical trials and regulatory approval. We have existing relationships with European health authorities that could get your treatment into compassionate use programs within months instead of years. What's the catch? Brad smiled. No catch. Well, except that you'd have to share credit for the discovery, and Phoenix would handle manufacturing and distribution. But you'd retain control over the research direction, and we commit to making the treatment available at cost to patients who can't afford it. Margaret was listening intently. Mr. Hoffman, are you saying Emma could actually receive this treatment? If Dr. Vasquez agrees to work with us, and if the treatment proves effective in trials, then yes. Children like Emma could have access to this therapy much sooner than through traditional pharmaceutical development. Elena felt a surge of hope mixed with skepticism. Mr. Hoffman, why would Phoenix Biotech be interested in a treatment that Meridian considered unprofitable? Because we're not Meridian, Brad replied. Phoenix was founded specifically to develop treatments for rare diseases. We operate on smaller profit margins, and we measure success differently. For us, helping 2,000 children worldwide is a significant achievement. Agent Walsh was watching this conversation with growing interest. If Elena's research could be legitimized through a proper pharmaceutical partnership, it would strengthen the argument that Captain Torres's actions were motivated by genuine medical necessity rather than criminal intent. Dr. Vasquez, Agent Walsh said, if you were to formalize a partnership with a legitimate pharmaceutical company, it would help demonstrate that your materials truly are medical research rather than biological threats. That could be significant in determining how Captain Torres's case is handled. Elena looked at her precious vials, then at Margaret's hopeful face, then at the other passengers who had been drawn into this extraordinary situation. Mr. Hoffman, I need guarantees. I need to know that Phoenix won't shut down my research if initial trials don't show immediate profit potential. Dr. Vasquez, I can have our legal team draft a contract that protects your research independence and guarantees funding through Phase 3 trials regardless of preliminary results. We believe in this treatment, and we believe in you. Margaret reached over and took Elena's hand. Dr. Vasquez, I've watched pharmaceutical companies promise things to desperate families before, but this man flew across the Atlantic to be on the same plane as you, and our captain risked his career to make sure your research reaches London. Sometimes, extraordinary circumstances create extraordinary opportunities. Elena felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. Everything she had worked for, everything Captain Torres had risked, everything these families hoped for, it all came down to this moment at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. Mr. Hoffman, she said finally, if Phoenix Biotech is willing to commit to making my treatment available to patients regardless of their ability to pay, and if you can guarantee that research decisions will be made based on medical need rather than profit potential, then we have a deal. Brad smiled and extended his hand. Dr. Vasquez, I think we can save some lives together. As they shook hands, Agent Walsh was already on her phone with federal authorities, explaining the new developments and arguing that Captain Torres' actions had been vindicated by the discovery of a legitimate pharmaceutical partnership. But their relief was short-lived. The plane's intercom crackled to life with an announcement that would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're beginning our descent into London Heathrow Airport, where we expect to land in approximately 1 hour. However, I've been informed that upon landing, the aircraft will be surrounded by law enforcement officials from multiple agencies. I want to thank you all for your patience during this unusual flight, and I want you to know that whatever happens to me, I believe we've done the right thing today. Elena looked out the window at the gray expanse of clouds below and realized that their real test was just beginning. In 1 hour, they would land in London, where the world would be watching to see whether her research could truly help children like Emma, and whether Captain Torres would pay the ultimate price for his courage. As Flight 847 began its descent toward London Heathrow, the atmosphere in the cabin was a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and hope. Elena clutched her research materials while staring out the window at the sprawling city below, knowing that the next few hours would determine not only her own fate, but the future of children like Emma Whitmore. In the cockpit, Captain Torres was in communication with London Air Traffic Control, but the conversation was unlike any he'd experienced in his 23 years of flying. United 847, this is London Heathrow Tower, came the crisp British accent through his headset. You're cleared for landing on runway 27R, but be advised that upon touchdown, you're to taxi directly to Gate C1, where you'll be met by federal agents from multiple agencies. Do not deviate from the prescribed taxi route. London Tower, this is United 847, Torres responded. Understood. We are carrying passengers who have been through an extraordinary situation, and I want to ensure their safety and comfort during the ground procedures. Captain Torres, the air traffic controller's voice carried a note of personal concern. I've been flying for 15 years myself, and I want you to know that there are a lot of people here who understand why you made the decisions you did. The medical authorities have been briefed on your passengers' research, and there's already significant interest from pediatric specialists. Torres felt a mixture of relief and dread. Thank you, London Tower. That means more than you know. As the plane descended through the clouds, Elena was having an intense conversation with Brad Hoffman about the logistics of getting her research samples to Great Ormond Street Hospital, where Dr. James Morrison was waiting with a team of specialists. The problem, Elena explained, is that these samples have a limited shelf life once exposed to temperature variations. If we're detained for hours during customs and security procedures, the samples could become useless. Brad was already working his phone, coordinating with Phoenix Biotech's London office and their regulatory affairs team. Dr. Vasquez, I've arranged for a specialized medical transport team to meet us at the gate. They have the equipment to maintain proper storage conditions for your samples while we deal with the legal procedures. Agent Walsh, who had been monitoring communications with her superiors throughout the flight, finally received the update she'd been hoping for. Dr. Vasquez, I just received word from FBI headquarters. Given the new information about your pharmaceutical partnership and the medical nature of your research, federal prosecutors are recommending that any charges against you be dropped. You'll still need to go through a formal debriefing, but you're not going to be arrested. Elena felt a surge of relief, but her thoughts immediately turned to Captain Torres. What about the captain? Agent Walsh's expression grew somber. That's more complicated. Captain Torres violated federal aviation regulations, international treaties, and technically committed hijacking by taking control of a commercial aircraft against federal orders. Even with the medical justification, there will be serious legal consequences. Margaret, who had been listening to every word, stood up with the fierce determination of someone who had spent decades fighting for patients' rights. Agent Walsh, I want to make something perfectly clear. Captain Torres didn't hijack this plane. He saved it. He saved my granddaughter's life and the lives of hundreds of other children who might benefit from Dr. Vasquez's research. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand your feelings, but... No, Agent Walsh, I don't think you do understand. Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. I spent 40 years as a hospital administrator, dealing with insurance companies, pharmaceutical corporations, and government bureaucrats who put policies and profits ahead of patients' lives. What Captain Torres did today was exactly what every doctor and nurse wishes they could do when they see children suffering because of administrative red tape. As Margaret spoke, other passengers began to gather around them. The businessman who had initially been concerned about biological threats, the young mother with 2 children, the elderly couple returning from their anniversary trip. One by one, they voiced their support for Captain Torres. That captain is a hero, said the young mother. If my children were sick and someone could help them, I want someone like him making the decisions. Absolutely, agreed the businessman. I was wrong to panic earlier. This man deserves a medal, not a prison sentence. Elena was overwhelmed by the support, but she knew that public opinion wouldn't be enough to protect Captain Torres from the legal consequences of his actions. As the plane descended toward Heathrow, she was formulating a plan that could save both her research and the captain's career. Agent Walsh, she said, what if Captain Torres's actions could be legally justified as a medical emergency response? What do you mean? Elena pulled out her phone and showed Agent Walsh several medical articles she had downloaded during the flight. I've been researching British law regarding medical emergencies and aircraft diversions. Under international aviation law, captains have broad authority to make decisions necessary to preserve life and health, even if those decisions contradict direct orders from ground control. Dr. Vasquez, that provision typically applies to passengers having heart attacks or similar immediate medical emergencies, not transporting research materials. But what if the research materials were urgently needed to save lives that were in immediate danger? Elena continued. I've been in contact with Dr. Morrison at Great Ormond Street Hospital. He has 4 children with advanced Kepler-Morrison syndrome who are expected to die within the next 2 weeks without intervention. Their conditions have deteriorated rapidly, and traditional treatments have failed. Agent Walsh was beginning to see where Elena was heading with this argument. You're suggesting that Captain Torres was responding to a medical emergency involving critically ill patients in London? I'm suggesting that Captain Torres received information about desperately sick children and made a command decision to ensure that potentially life-saving medical supplies reach them as quickly as possible. That's not hijacking. That's heroic emergency response. Brad Hoffman was nodding enthusiastically. Dr. Vasquez, that's brilliant. If we can document that there were children in immediate danger who could benefit from your treatment, Captain Torres's actions become medically justified rather than criminally motivated. Margaret was practically beaming. Dr. Vasquez, you're not just a scientist, you're a strategist. This could work. As they discussed the legal strategy, the plane touched down at Heathrow with a gentle thud that belied the drama of their journey. Elena looked out the window and saw what appeared to be half the law enforcement apparatus of the United Kingdom waiting for them. Police cars, federal agents, customs officials, and medical personnel with specialized equipment. Captain Torres's voice came over the intercom one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow Airport. Local time is 3:47 p.m., and the temperature is 18 degrees Celsius. I want to thank you for your patience and understanding during what has been an extraordinary flight. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that it has been an honor to serve as your captain today. As the plane taxied toward Gate C1, Elena made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She stood up and addressed the entire first-class cabin. Everyone, I need you to listen carefully. When we get off this plane, there are going to be reporters, federal agents, and government officials asking questions about what happened during our flight. I want you to know the truth. Captain Torres didn't hijack this plane. He made a heroic decision to ensure that medical supplies reached children who were dying from a rare blood disorder. She held up her research materials. These vials contain a treatment that could save the lives of hundreds of children worldwide. Captain Torres risked everything to make sure this treatment reaches doctors who can test it and potentially save lives. He's not a criminal, he's a hero. Margaret stood up beside Elena. Dr. Vasquez is absolutely right. My granddaughter Emma is dying from the same condition Dr. Vasquez has been researching. Captain Torres may have saved Emma's life today and the lives of many other children. As the passengers prepared to disembark, Elena felt a strange sense of calm. She had spent 8 years developing her treatment in the isolation of a laboratory, but now she had allies. Unexpected allies who had come together at 35,000 feet to support something bigger than themselves. Agent Walsh approached Elena as they prepared to leave the aircraft. Dr. Vasquez, I want you to know that I'll be recommending that Captain Torres receive commendation rather than punishment for his actions today. What he did was technically illegal, but it was also morally correct. Elena smiled. Agent Walsh, thank you. But I think Captain Torres is going to need more than a recommendation. He's going to need the world to understand that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to save lives. As the aircraft door opened and Elena stepped onto the jet bridge leading into Heathrow Airport, she carried with her not just 12 vials of potential medicine, but the hopes of children, families, and medical professionals around the world. Behind her, Captain Torres was preparing to face the consequences of the most important decision of his life. The real test was about to begin. The scene at Gate C1 of London Heathrow Airport was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. As passengers disembarked from Flight 847, they were greeted by a carefully orchestrated operation involving federal agents, medical personnel, customs officials, and a media presence that had grown from a few local reporters to an international news event. Elena was among the first passengers to be escorted off the plane, her precious research materials now under the protection of a specialized medical transport team arranged by Phoenix Biotech. Agent Walsh stayed close to her side as they navigated through the crowd of officials waiting to interview everyone involved in what the media was already calling the doctor's flight. Captain Torres emerged from the cockpit looking remarkably calm for someone who had just committed what could be classified as hijacking a commercial aircraft. He was immediately surrounded by federal agents, but Elena was struck by their respectful demeanor. These weren't agents arresting a terrorist. They were officials dealing with a situation that had no clear precedent in aviation law. Dr. Vasquez, said a tall man in an expensive suit who approached her with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. I'm Dr. James Morrison from Great Ormond Street Hospital. I've been following your research for 2 years, and I've been waiting for this moment. Elena felt a surge of relief and excitement. Dr. Morrison, thank you for arranging the London connection. Are the children you mentioned still alive, but barely, Dr. Morrison replied gravely. Emma Whitmore's granddaughter is one of them, along with 3 other children whose conditions have deteriorated rapidly in the past week. If your treatment works, Dr. Vasquez, we're looking at the potential to save not just these 4 children, but hundreds of others worldwide. As they spoke, Margaret was being reunited with family members who had flown to London from Manchester. Elena watched as an emotional reunion unfolded between Margaret and a man she assumed was Emma's father. Dr. Vasquez, Margaret called out, I want you to meet my son David, Emma's father. David Whitmore was a man in his 40s with the exhausted look of a parent who had spent too many nights in hospital waiting rooms. When he shook Elena's hand, his grip was firm, but his eyes were filled with desperate hope. Dr. Vasquez, I don't know if my mother explained, but she's running out of time. The doctors in Manchester have tried everything, and they've basically told us to prepare for the worst. Elena felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being a doctor. Mr. Whitmore, I can't make any promises about the effectiveness of my treatment, but I can promise you that we're going to try everything possible to help Emma. That's all we can ask for, David replied, his voice breaking slightly. Meanwhile, Captain Torres was being escorted through a formal interview process with aviation authorities, but the tone was more investigative than accusatory. Elena could see through the glass walls of the conference room, where he was being questioned, and she was struck by his composed demeanor. Agent Walsh approached Elena with an update. Dr. Vasquez, I've just received word from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Given the medical nature of your materials and the pharmaceutical partnership you've established, they're declining to pursue any charges related to your transportation of biological materials. Elena felt a wave of relief. What about Captain Torres? That's more complicated, but there's been an interesting development. The story of Flight 847 has gone viral on social media, and there's been an unprecedented outpouring of public support for Captain Torres. Aviation professionals, medical personnel, and patient advocacy groups are calling him a hero rather than a criminal. Elena looked over at Captain Torres, who was still being interviewed by federal officials. Agent Walsh, is there anything I can do to help his case? Actually, yes. If you're willing to testify that Captain Torres's actions were necessary to preserve life, specifically the lives of critically ill children who needed urgent access to your treatment, it could provide legal justification for his decisions under international medical emergency protocols. Elena didn't hesitate. Of course I'll testify. Captain Torres risked everything to help save children's lives. The least I can do is help save his career. Brad Hoffman had been coordinating with Phoenix Biotech's legal team and approached Elena with a folder full of documents. Dr. Vasquez, we've prepared a formal partnership agreement that guarantees funding for your research through Phase 3 clinical trials, regardless of preliminary results. We've also included provisions for compassionate use access for critically ill patients like Emma. Elena reviewed the documents quickly, her trained eye scanning for the details that would protect both her research and the patients who needed it. Mr. Hoffman, this looks exactly like what we discussed on the plane. How quickly can we get this treatment to the children who need it? Dr. Morrison has already arranged for emergency compassionate use authorization from British health authorities. If the children's parents consent, we could begin treatment as early as tomorrow. Elena felt a mixture of excitement and terror. After 8 years of research, her treatment was finally going to be tested on the patients it was designed to help. What about the risks? These children are critically ill, and we don't have complete safety data. Dr. Morrison joined their conversation. Dr. Vasquez, I've reviewed all of your research data, and the risk-benefit analysis is clear. These children are dying, and traditional treatments have failed. Your therapy represents their only hope. As Elena signed the partnership agreement with Phoenix Biotech, she was surrounded by the people who had made this moment possible. Margaret and David Whitmore, Agent Walsh, Brad Hoffman, Dr. Morrison, and the other passengers from Flight 847 who had supported her during the most critical hours of her career. But her attention was drawn to Captain Torres, who had just emerged from his interview with federal officials. He looked tired but not defeated, and when he saw Elena, he walked over with a slight smile. Dr. Vasquez, he said, I hear your treatment is going to get a chance to help some children. Elena stood up and looked directly into his eyes. Captain Torres, what you did today, risking your career and your freedom to help save children's lives, that's the kind of heroism that gives me hope for humanity. Captain Torres shrugged modestly. Dr. Vasquez, 30 years from now, when those children are adults living full, healthy lives because of your research, nobody's going to remember the regulations I broke to get you here. They're going to remember that science and compassion won out over bureaucracy and fear. Agent Walsh approached them with a final update on Captain Torres's legal situation. Captain, I've just received word from federal prosecutors on both sides of the Atlantic. Given the medical emergency justification and the extraordinary public support for your actions, They're recommending that you receive a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining rather than criminal charges. Captain Torres felt 20 pounds of weight lift off his shoulders. Agent Walsh, does that mean I can keep flying? It means you'll be grounded for 6 months while you complete additional training and psychological evaluation. But yes, you should be able to return to commercial aviation. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. Captain Torres, thank you. Thank you for believing in my research. Thank you for risking everything. And thank you for showing me what real courage looks like. As the passengers from Flight 847 began to disperse, some heading to connecting flights, others to hotels, and some to emotional reunions with family, Elena prepared for the next phase of her journey. Her research samples were being transported under proper medical protocols to Great Ormond Street Hospital, where 4 children were waiting for what might be their last hope. Margaret approached Elena one final time before leaving for Manchester. Dr. Vasquez, I want you to know that regardless of what happens with Emma's treatment, you've already given us something precious, hope. For the first time in months, we have reason to believe that Emma might have a future. Elena hugged the elderly woman who had become an unexpected ally and friend. Mrs. Whitmore, I promise you that we're going to do everything possible to help Emma and all the other children who are fighting this condition. As Elena left Heathrow Airport and headed toward Great Ormond Street Hospital, she reflected on the extraordinary events of the past 24 hours. She had started the day as a disgraced researcher carrying illegal biological materials across international borders. She was ending it as part of a pharmaceutical partnership with the backing of federal authorities and the support of people around the world. But most importantly, she was ending it with the opportunity to find out whether 8 years of research could actually save lives. The next morning, Elena stood in a hospital room in London, watching as 4-year-old Emma Whitmore receive the first dose of her experimental treatment. Emma's parents held her hands while Dr. Morrison monitored her vital signs, and Elena said a silent prayer to her sister Carmen, whose death had started Elena on this journey 8 years earlier. Carmen, she whispered, I think we finally made it. 6 months later, Emma Whitmore was playing soccer with children twice her age, her energy levels completely normal for the first time in her life. Captain Torres had returned to flying commercial aircraft and had been honored by the International Association of Airline Pilots for his courage in the face of impossible circumstances. Elena's treatment had been approved for compassionate use in 12 countries and was showing remarkable success rates in clinical trials. And in research labs around the world, scientists were developing new treatments for other rare diseases, inspired by the story of the doctor who carried hope across the Atlantic and the captain who risked everything to make sure that hope reached the children who needed it most. Flight 847 had become more than a journey from Chicago to London. It had become a symbol of what's possible when ordinary people make extraordinary choices in the service of saving lives. Elena's story proved that sometimes the most important cargo you can carry isn't listed on any manifest, and sometimes the most critical navigation decisions aren't found in any flight manual. They had ignored her boarding the plane, treating her as just another passenger. But by the time they landed in London, everyone understood that she had been carrying something more precious than luggage. She had been carrying hope itself. And sometimes, hope is worth breaking every rule in the book. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.